Hello everyone, welcome to Longarming. Hello everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn, and I'm going to go ahead and put my mic out. I meant to do this video yesterday and we got carried away doing some other stuff around the house. So this is my Quilty BBL. And here's the patching in block that I had to add. You can see I guesstimate the size and make it too big, partial seam it in there, quilt it on, and then I don't do the trimming until the very end, just in case. So vintage quilts, no quilt is really as flat and square as you think it is, but vintage quilts in particular, the fabric that they were made from was used and therefore not as flat and square and even. The grain has become wobbly and everything when it went into the quilt. And then this quilt was used for many years, so that introduces more, like, buy 2 pairs of jeans, put one aside, wear and launder one for 5 years, and come back and compare those 2 pairs of jeans. They're not the same. And like the knees of the jeans you've been using will be like rounded, where your knees are bending and pushing into the fabric. It's the same thing with a quilt. It's going to start to gradually take the form of the stresses and pressures that daily life has taken on shifting those fibers. So this quilt was very fragile and it had a lot of issues. So when you have a pop seam, if you continue using that, as you're sliding your quilt up your body, you can stick your toe in there and rip it. There's just a lot of danger in having this quilt becoming less and less stable and more what I would call friable, where it's just trying to fall apart over time. So by adding a lot of machine quilting and adding the stability of the new backing fabric, and in this case the old quilt was a Summerweight quilt and it didn't have any batting, but it did have backing, which is still in there, and it did have hand quilting, which is still in there, but we've gone ahead and added some, she wanted the poly puff batting, so that's what went in here. So this is a lot more stable and usable quilt. This is a quilt at this point, even as old as it is, I would feel very comfortable throwing this in the washing machine, letting the kids use it on the couch. Some interesting things, so there are some repairs, and I'm going to show you these two here. So pull this table up. Here we've got a Band-Aid, and you can kind of see it looks, it's kind of a random, not exactly 4-patchy quilt anyway, so these little Band-Aids look similar to the rest of the quilt. If you're not looking for it, it kind of blends in. And I tried to pick fabrics that would blend in with the era of the other scraps in here so it would be less obvious. And then this one here I just darned down. Well, it's quite large, and now that it's batted, it's quite heavy. So here, I just darned the seam. The seam was starting to pop, and I just put a lot of very dense sort of back and forth quilting over there to darn it down to the new backing and binding and stabilize that. So here's another little Band-Aid. This one, that's actually a block from the original quilt. So the additional quilting and sealing over any raw edges that have appeared is going to stabilize this quilt and make it be robust and usable for many more years. And as you know, any quilt that gets stored away in that musty, dusty attic is not something that becomes part of your lives and you remember. So it's up there for 1, 2, 3 generations. Somebody pulls that out. They no longer know that person who made it. They no longer know the backstory. These fabrics were from clothing and household items that were around the house that would evoke memories for someone. And if it's not carried forward, like this is on the couch and someone says, oh, these were my curtains when I was a little girl in my room. I love them. My grandmother made them for me. And nobody's attaching that meaning to this little piece of fabric for long enough, the memories that made this quilt special start to fade away. So by keeping it sturdy and usable and launderable, you can keep those stories alive and keep those people alive in your hearts a lot longer. So I know I'm kind of waxing poetic, but the Quilty BBL to me is a very important and powerful thing to keep these quilts going and not have to be so precious and worry about them like, we're going to destroy it. You're not going to destroy it. It's fully stabilized. It's in great shape now. You're not going to stick your toe under any edges and cause a rip and break somebody's heart. So you can also not forget about the quilt and break somebody's heart. So this can be used now. Okay, so it's got the full quilt. You can see this is just a single layer of fabric because this is my block that I patched in here. And on the edge, you can see this is where the this was seamed right sides together and turned inside out on these edges, or right side out on these edges. So I just stitched that close to the edge down. So this is the original quilt, the original backing. It was Summerweight, so no batting. She wanted to add batting, and then the backing material that I added, and she opted for a yellow. And I'm not rolling the back binding, but it is going to get a yellow binding, so it's going to look like that from the same solid fabric. So now we're just going to trim this quilt. Whee! And I'll have to speed this up like 150 times. And I forgot to add that this quilt is not square, and I decided I had to choose between squaring it off and losing some of the original top, or letting it be not square and keeping more of the original top. So I decided to keep more of it. So I'm just going to trim it the size it actually is, and then bind around it even if it's not perfectly square and straight. I did do a few adjustments to help flatten the quilt. That didn't really lose anything, and when I find those, we'll show those too. So this is not going to be perfect 90-degree angles in the corner and perfectly 90-degree sides, because the quilt was not that way to begin with. And I'm not here to change history, I'm just here to preserve it. Okay, so let's take a look at this area right here, and while it's unbound you can still see it. So right here I had to take a magic pleat that made this sashing taper, which is okay because this sashing varies in width all over the quilt as it goes along the strip, so it's not going to sort of blow the look of the quilt out of the water. This fits in with how it looks all over the rest of the quilt other places. So what happened is this block here, which is original to the quilt, was, maybe the block was not square. I think it was a little bit larger and maybe not square, or maybe not sewn on square. So as I was quilting down to this area, this block was either going to have a huge fold in it, like the magic pleats were removing 2 entire blocks from the end, and then dealing with all this fullness here. And that was going to be a much more noticeable adjustment to flatten this out and make me able to quilt it without a huge pleat showing up, or where it kinks over. So this was going to be an issue, but by easing in this fullness, and I decided to keep the block and sacrifice the sashing, and that was in keeping with how the rest of the quilt looked. So I just did a tiny magic pleat here. It's big relative to the magic pleat that you would put in a new quilt top done by modern standards on a flat surface with a rotary cutter and a seam guide. These were done all hand sewn, all hand cut, and this would have been made in your lap. So there's no flat surface on your lap to check and realize whether you're flat or not. And it was just hand stitched, so you can see in the blocks they did magic pleats right in the blocks. They're not all square. They're not all the same size. So that blends pretty well. If I don't point that out to you, you're not going to see that magic pleat. And then this part where you actually can see that it's a magic pleat, when it gets enclosed in the binding, it'll not show that at all. Now I'm machine doing this because that is bulk. I got the seam allowance from the sashing and the seam allowance where they finished this corner all sort of piled up there. So it is a little hard spot because of how much bulk in terms of seam allowance is there. But that was really the only major flattening that I had to do on this quilt, other than the normal flattening that you do on the long arm for every single quilt, which has to do with adjusting the tension of how it's mounted and doing a little cat's paw and easing in fullness here and there with your quilting. Those are standard things that we do on every quilt, whether they're vintage or not. You can see a little band-aid here, little band-aid here. But if I didn't point them out, it kind of disappears into the general scrappiness of this quilt. Alright, so I am going to use some of the trimmed off excess backing fabric in the same yellow to cut strips. Go ahead and apply my binding, and from the back, I think you can see here there's been a couple of darning repairs, but if you step back, they're not even that obvious and that disruptive to the overall quilt pattern. And let's see if I can find the back of a band-aid. Back of a band-aid looks like that. Ugh. So it's visible, but not super noticeable if you're looking at the whole quilt and I don't point it out. So I'm going to cut those strips and we'll apply this binding, and this one will be done and ready to return to its loving family. Ta-da! And this is the final result. It's a much sturdier quilt. It's going to last a lot of years. I would say that this is even machine washable so that you can really use this in your household. It's got this lovely yellow binding. It's huge. Really cute. Lovely yellow binding on there. I did some little tumbling squares. There's a lot of paisley in there, and then this Grecian square on all the borders and sashings. And I think she's going to love it. I think she's going to be really happy with the result. And I probably need to clean that screen. It looks a little schmutzy. There we go.